On the western slope of Battle Ridge, between Last Stand Hill and the Little Bighorn River, there are about 50-some markers that form a ragged line. These markers are referred to as the South Skirmish Line and lead to a deep ravine called, Deep Ravine. Based on archaeological evidence and eyewitness testimony from both soldiers and Indians, there's no doubt that fighting and dying took place here. The problem is, there appears to be too many markers on the South Skirmish Line, and currently there are none inside Deep Ravine. So, were soldiers actually killed in Deep Ravine, and are they still there? Soldiers in the Frontier Army identified with their company more than they did their regiment. Your company was who you were stationed with, who you ate with, who you marched with, who you lived with. It wasn't, I'm in the 7th Cavalry. It was, I'm in company whatever, 7th Cavalry. And each company took on its own flavor and personality. In fact, the 1876 campaign was the first time in the 7th's history that the entire regiment, all 12 companies, were in the field together. Now back in 1868, right before the Battle of the Washita, Custer reorganized all of his company's horses according to color. You could say that it serves a tactical purpose by helping to identify individual companies at a distance, but really, Custer did it because he thought it looked badass. Generally, the soldiers were against it. Company E got all the gray horses and became known as the Gray Horse Troop. This is important since at the Little Bighorn, when Indian eyewitnesses talk about the gray horses, we know exactly what company they're talking about. Company E's men were generally some of the more experienced of the regiment. Only about 10% had less than a year of Army service. They were commanded by First Lieutenant Algernon Smith and Second Lieutenant James Sturgis. On the morning of June 25th, when Custer divided his regiment into battalions on the way to the Little Bighorn, he actually divided his men into 5 battalions. Major Reno had companies A, G, and M. Captain Benteen had D, H, and K. Captain Miles Keogh had companies C, I, and L. And Captain George Yates had companies E and F. Captain Thomas McDougall took Company B and an NCO and 6 men from each company and took charge of the pack animals. Now, years later, Indian warriors were interviewed about what they saw at Custer's part of the battle. The warriors who fought Custer reported seeing soldiers move along Battle Ridge toward where the monument now stands. Among this group were soldiers riding gray horses. Several warriors state the gray horses became mixed in with other horses at the end of the ridge, today known as Last Stand Hill. A group of the soldiers actually went further north in the hill and threatened to cross the river north of the Cheyenne portion of the village. However, these soldiers pulled back toward the present-day cemetery and met back at the hill. The Gray Horse soldiers next came down the hill toward the river and dismounted, exchanging fire with the Indians. The Indians were able to stampede the Gray Horses away from the soldiers, and many of the horses were captured down by the river. Now on foot, these soldiers were either killed in place, made their way back to Last Stand Hill, or ran toward the nearest terrain feature they saw that offered cover, Deep Ravine. The warriors reported at least a few soldiers, maybe as few as 4 or 5, getting into a deep gulch or deep gully and being killed there. In total, 39 Company E soldiers, including 2 officers, 3 sergeants, 4 corporals, 2 trumpeters, and 28 privates, were killed in action. 10 of them were able to be identified. The commander, Lieutenant Smith, was found on Last Stand Hill, away from his unit. First Sergeant Frederick Holmeyer's body was identified among the company by his name stitched on one of his socks. Second Lieutenant Sturgis's body was never found, or at least never identified. After the battle, soldiers policing the area and burying the dead reported seeing a number of bodies inside Deep Ravine. The numbers reported varied from person to person, but the most common number given is 28. These men were reported as being from E Company. 3 years after the battle, during Reno's court of inquiry, Captain Miles Moylan, commander of Company A, gave the following testimony. After leaving this place, I rode up to this point, I think in company with Major Reno. In the ravine marked as H on the map, we found 20-odd bodies of E Company. They were undoubtedly fighting and retreating. I could see where they had passed down the edge and attempted to scramble up on the other side, which was almost perpendicular. The marks were plain where they had used their hands to get up, but the marks only extended halfway up the bank. At the same court of inquiry, Captain Thomas McDougall, Company B commander, stated, I only went to where I presumed the skirmish line was killed. Major Reno then ordered me to take my company and go to the village and get implements to bury the dead. On returning, he ordered me to bury Company E, the one I had formerly commanded for 5 years, and to identify the men as far as possible. I found most of them in a ravine. That is where the most of Company E were found, to the best of my recollection. About half were in the ravine, and the other half on a line outside. All the men were lying on their faces, and appeared to have been shot mostly in the side. I thought they fought the best they could, and probably were attacked from both sides. So here's the problem. There's 50-odd markers along the south skirmish line, and some are on the top of Deep Ravine, but none inside the ravine. Now there are two possibilities about the bodies in Deep Ravine. Either they're there, or they're not. If they ever were there, how and why were they moved? If they never were there, then why did word spread that they were? One theory is that the troopers were never in Deep Ravine. The ravine that the eyewitnesses refer to is actually the broad basin area that contains the south skirmish line. Which, yeah, you could call this broad descending area a ravine. In the 1980s, a series of excavations were done inside Deep Ravine itself to try and find some traces of soldiers. None was found. Plus, the soldiers who reburied remains in the years after the battle placed stakes in the ground wherever they found remains. None were ever placed inside Deep Ravine. Same thing with the marble markers a few years later. If soldiers were killed in the ravine, it's not likely they were pulled out and reburied somewhere else. By the time they were buried, they'd been decomposing for 3 days, and they weren't in any condition to be moved. Soldiers just threw dirt on top of the bodies. I'm not a geologist, but apparently the angle of Deep Ravine's floor means it's not likely that the soldiers' bones were washed out to the river either. So the reason there's no markers in Deep Ravine is because there were never any soldiers in Deep Ravine. That's the theory. On the other hand, you have the testimony of numerous people, both Army and Indian, who say that soldiers were killed in a deep terrain feature. Captain McDougall told a courtroom how half of the E Company men he had commanded for years, were half inside a ravine and half out. Captain Moylan even described how he could see where the soldiers had tried clawing their way up the sides of the ravine. There's only one spot on the battlefield that fits that description: Deep Ravine. Photographs show the ravine's walls have collapsed some since the 1870s. Maybe the soldiers are buried deeper than originally thought. And archaeological excavations of the markers around the rim of Deep Ravine have dug up plenty of bullets and casings. There's just too many eyewitnesses to completely disregard the idea that there are bodies still inside the ravine. So what's the answer? I have no idea, but I'd like to hear what you think. So leave a comment on this video explaining what you think happened to the Gray Horse Troop. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications by hitting that bell icon. Thanks for watching.